Sherry Dixon has a riveting story to tell. Her mom was a prisoner of war at the age of 8, but Sherry didn't hear about the story until she turned 50. Now Sherry details the story of her mom being a prisoner of war in a book called Natural Destiny. I talk one-on-one with the author for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Close-Ups on Facebook. Sherry Dixon, welcome to the award-winning Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you, Quintin. Good to be with you.
Oh, I appreciate it greatly. I know that obviously you are a woman of faith and hope. You're an author of a fictional book, but it has a lot of real details in it called Natural Destiny. You're a spiritual coach, a wife, a mother, a grand and great-grandmother, a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Let me ask you this, Sherry. What would be the title of your life right now?
The title of my life. What a wonderful question. I think it's just a life of possibilities. Even though I just retired from a career of, I was in environmental health and safety for almost 50 years.
Wow.
I feel like I'm just starting out.
Wow. And what are those other possibilities right now?
I am working on my second book. My first book, Natural Destiny, as you just talked about, is a story about my mother. And her life, of course, as mothers' lives do, had so much influence on me. And so my second book is actually a memoir of my life and how her life and her teachings to me ended up affecting me and my children and, of course, anyone else that we came in contact with.
Wow. And let me jump right into the first book, Natural Destiny. I want to go back to the Berkeley Independent because I believe they wrote an article about your book back in 2013. And it reads this.
Yes.
Sherry Dixon was 50 when she first learned about her mother's terrifying past. Why 50?
Amazing, isn't it?
Yes, ma'am.
My mother and I have always been very, very close. And I was 50 years old when I first learned about that. And it was just a very unusual way to learn about it. I was at her home in Savannah at the time. She lived in Savannah. And she was looking out the window and she put her hand to her chest. I thought she was having a heart attack. So I immediately went to her and she said, Sherry, I need to tell you something. And that's when she started telling me about her life as a prisoner of war on her native island of Guam. She was 8 years old when the Japanese landed on the island. And for 3 years, she, along with thousands of other Chamorro people, were held prisoner of war. And it was just incredible to find out, number one, that even happened to her, and number two, that I didn't know anything about it. If you are a follower of World War II or like that history, the Pacific Campaign, a lot of people don't even know about Guam or the importance of Guam, and they don't know about what happened to the people there. And so my book is not only about my mother's life as an 8-year-old child, but also how it affected the out of that. It's an easy read, and it starts off as a young adult crossover. So it's middle school and up can enjoy the story.
And I know that obviously you were down in Savannah when you heard the story at the age of 50. I know this might be maybe a complicated question, but what particular age that you wanted to hear this particular story?
You know, it's one of those kind of stories that you would enjoy. Not maybe enjoy might not be the right word. Be interested in, because it is a story of the kind of horror that happened during a war. For example, I was not sure if I should even have it as a young adult crossover, but my editor thought that it would be a very good story for the children to learn as well. So if you're middle school or up, but if you are a World War II enthusiast, you would enjoy the story also. It's actually a story of life lessons, because my mother learned very early on about discipline. She also learned a lot about forgiveness.
Right.
She learned about the enemy that's inside of us that is fear, that keeps us from doing what we need to do. It's a story of coming of age, and it's also a story of making choices to go to the way of peace and joy versus the way of fear and anger. Because one of the things my mother told me very early on, and she learned the same thing from her elders, was when you are upset about something, don't get angry, get busy. And
Mm.
that is to take that energy and put it into something more useful, to make change instead of dwelling on the fear and the anger that maybe what you feel like immediately to do. So that's one of the things, is that as a child you can learn these lessons, and
Right.
as an adult you can learn these lessons.
And you talk about obviously getting busy. Let me talk to you about this. Obviously, you just mentioned your mom was a prisoner of war really at a very young age. How did she get busy without letting fear get to her?
Hmm. Well, that's where I think not only her faith, because her faith was just really developing as an
Right.
8-year-old child.
Right.
What helped her was the culture of the island, because when the war hit, she found herself homeless. And the way the people of the island of Guam are, that no child is ever homeless. And someone immediately took her under her wing. I call her Grandmother Lily in the book. But Grandmother Lily was a very woman of strong faith. She knew that there was always someone watching over her. There was always someone who loved her unconditionally. And even though they were surrounded by all of this horrible stuff that comes along with war, she knew she had a choice, that she could go within and find her faith and the love of God. And so she held on to my mother that way. And my mother, who could have come out of the war, someone filled with fear and anger and hatred and revenge and all of that, because she had the love of this woman, she also developed a life of fear. I mean, excuse me, of
Right.
love and
Right.
joy and peace. And she knew she had a choice to do that. And that's how she taught us as well.
Now, between the age of 8 and 11, when did your mom actually develop her faith?
It was a progressive thing, because she, as a child, had always gone to church. She was brought
Yes.
up as a Catholic. And the Catholicism at the time, the way my mother explained it to me, different from Catholicism in the States. The Chamorro people were very connected to Mother Earth. And my mother and her tribe took the Catholicism and sort of built it in to the way they had the reverence for Mother Earth. So she had that kind of as her foundation, but she was an 8-year-old child, so it wasn't really a very strong foundation. But as things came along, and like, for example, the first beheading that she saw as a 9-year-old child, you can imagine how that would have set someone up to just go into themselves totally and just be filled with anger. And she was angry. She was upset. She did, of course, understand what was going on. And Grandmother Lily and others that were around her helped her understand how this was not something that she should take personally into herself, but to try to understand how it fit into the total world. I think what happens to us is we take fear and we take the things that happen around us that are bad and hold it inside ourselves so much to the point that we cannot find the joy and the peace and the love that are inherently who we are, until we can get rid of that fear. And that's what Grandmother Lily and other people on the island did for her.
Now, when your mom unfortunately had to witness that first beheading, what did she do to really, release that anger and that fear?
Yes, I have to tell you that one of the strong personalities in my book was my uncle. His name was Herman, And at the
Okay.
time, she did not know that was her brother. That has a lot to do with the story. So it's something she discovered later. But what Uncle Herman did before she saw her first beheading, he told her what she must not do. She wasn't allowed when she saw because he told her everything that was coming up. And he said, you cannot react because if you react, you will also be killed. And so in the midst of watching all of that, she saw and focused on a red bird that she saw in the distance. And she took everything that she was seeing and feeling and she put it into that bird. The blood that she was actually seeing, she saw the redness of the bird. So she transferred her feelings of fear into the wonder of the bird. And, it may not seem like something that could be possible, but it absolutely is possible. What she found after she saw that first beheading was how much discipline she actually had in her tiny little self. And that discipline and that drive and that intensity actually helped her survive in the war. Lots of different stories along the way. But I think as adults, we learn that too, because my mother passed that on to us, to take that discipline and take that purpose and put it somewhere else rather than destroying ourselves, to take it out of ourselves and become something that's more positive.
Now that red bird, did you ever talk to your mom and say, "Hey, was that a gift from God?"
Oh, well, that was only one very big gift from God. And I think I personally am very spiritual. I think that I'm probably more spiritual than I am religious,
Sure.
because I see that God's gifts are everywhere. And I'm positive that red bird was put there on purpose, as much as a lot of other things that happened along the way. She had people come into her life, all kinds of different synchronicities that happened, that was very definitely God and his angels watching over her, because there could have been other mistakes that she made along the way that would have ended up in her death. But instead, it moved her along into the path of life. And her life was very much needed, because she and other thousands of the Chamorro people ended up making such a huge difference in their lives along the way. I don't know if you're familiar with Guam, but it is a matriarchal society. And after the Japanese, after the Americans liberated Guam in 1944, the Chamorro women said, we're not here for revenge. We want to move on. We want to put this behind us. We want to make progress and take what we have learned and move forward. And I think that's one of the reasons why Guam turned around so much more quickly. And of course, the help of the American military.
And from the 1940s to now, what is the biggest difference about Guam?
Oh my gosh, you just would not believe it. I had a chance. The International Reading Association sent me on a book tour to Guam, and I had been there when I was 4 years old, but I, of course, didn't remember anything except one thing, Quintin. I remember dancing in the street because my father's car radio was on, and I loved to dance. So I was 4 years old, just dancing away. But I don't remember very much of anything. And I had that chance to go back. My mother actually went with me, and my baby sister. And she was just starting to lose her memory at the time. She now has Alzheimer's, so she doesn't remember very much. But she starting to lose her memory. But one of the things that impressed me so much was the Chamorro people indeed pushed themselves forward and got over it. And the Japanese people are very much an important part of the island of Guam. They're an important part of the tourist industry, for example. The Meningan Valley, which was horrific back in the days of the war, is a lush, beautiful place, and owned very much, a lot of it, by the Japanese people. So it was something that warms my heart to know that you can actually get past that kind of horror of war and move on and not hold on to the fear, because as you know, fear is just destruction. It destroys anything that comes in contact with it. and peace and joy are definitely the way to go.
And unfortunately, as you mentioned, your mom, I believe, now have Alzheimer's, and my grandmother had that along with dementia and passed away last year. But when did you just notice that obviously her condition took a turn for the worse, and you had to say, "Listen, we got to get this written down in a book"?
Yes, I noticed it little little ways, and first of all, I'm really sorry that you lost your grandmother. It is a disease that is very mystifying and hard to deal with, because especially when you're close with someone and they don't know who you are, uh, it's sort of like experiencing death over and over and over again of a loved one. So I'm sorry that you had to experience that as well. But I did notice that my mother was losing her memory, and I had talked with a traditional publishing company, and was going to go that way, but they told me it was going to be 2 years before it actually was published, my book. And I decided to go the self-publishing route because I wanted my mother to see the story and see it in a book before she was experiencing Alzheimer's in a total way. And Quintin, I'm so glad that I did that, because when she read the book for the first time, I was at first wondering if it was hurting her, because, as I said, it was a story of her memories. And there's one chapter in the book called The Execution. That was the time when she saw her first beheading. And she was acting a little nervous. And I said, "Mama, if you don't want me to publish this book, it will go in a drawer and no one will ever see it." And she said, no, I want you to publish it. It sounds like it has a happy ending. And she didn't realize how much joy and how many positive things that she gave as a result of being who she was. And so she wanted me to publish the book so that other people could see that although war has really horrible things that comes with it, there are also some things that come with it that aren't horrible. She learned a lot about herself. She learned a lot about what she could pass on as a mother. At the same time, I think that the way we value our veterans, we value our military, and everything that they give to us. And the Chamorro people have a Guam Liberation Day every day. There's a day in July usually that they do that. We have something in South Carolina right here in Charleston, right, in the area. We don't have ours in July though, because it's too hot.
Yes.
But I think one of the things that we forget sometimes, and we don't put enough emphasis on, is the collateral damage of war. When the American people liberated Guam, in order to be able to liberate Guam, they actually destroyed everything on the island except for the people. And so the Chamorro people had to basically start all over again. And they worked with the military to do that. We need to remember, when we're making a decision about war, that it's not just about that. It's about how, whatever the political ambition is, we must remember about the collateral damage of war, what comes along from war, what it destroys in the matter of people, and those people that are around the actual war going on. Because it destroys for generations. There's a healing that has to take place generations down the line. And that's what the second book is all about, is that.
When exactly did your mom started to take steps towards her healing?
Well, I don't think she realized that it was even going on. As a matter of fact, the generation, the World War II generation, those people, my mother included, they're very, very tough people. They get it done. They don't complain about a lot. But one of the things they also don't do is talk about it. And so one of the things, when I wrote this book, I started doing presentations all over the United States about the story, my mother's story. And what I found out was there are thousands of stories around. The people of that generation have so much to tell us. They have so much to give us, and we're losing them. They're passing away, and they're passing away with their stories inside them. And that's something we can't let happen. So I really want people who have in their lives, the people of that generation, to talk with them, talk with their grandparents, because they they have a lot to share. That happened. I was giving a presentation at a senior citizens home here in Charleston, and it was in May.
Yes.
And I finished the presentation, and of course the story is about my mother's life and on the island of Guam. Well, after I finished my presentation, this woman came up to me, a tall woman, very strong German accent, and she was just sobbing. And I said, "Oh my gosh, I've just upset this poor woman." And I sat and listened to her, and she said, "Thank you for telling my story." And I just looked at her, and she said, "No, I know I'm not from the island of Guam, but the very same thing happened to me and our people on the other side of the world. And I've never talked about it. And you have given me a reason to talk about it, because it's such an important piece of history that we don't need to keep it in our inside of ourselves." Are you familiar with StoryCorps, the
No.
StoryCorps organization?
No.
Well, maybe for your listeners,
Yes.
it's a nonprofit organization, and this group goes around the United States, and they get reports of listening to people. And I interviewed my mother before she lost her memory, and it is now part of the Library of Congress in the Americana section, as is thousands and thousands of other stories like that.
Wow. What other stories resonated with you when you spoke to these other folks around town and around the country?
Oh, well, yes, I'm so glad you asked me that question. One that really resonated with me was when I was on Guam.
Yeah.
When I was on Guam, I met a sister of the Catholic Church. She was retired, although I don't think they actually ever really retire.
Right.
But she was also a teacher, and I think she was more retired from teaching than she was retired from a sister of the church.
Right.
I met her, though, and she came up to me at a presentation that I was giving, and she said, "So you're the author?" And she was still in her habit, and I had gone to a Catholic school, and I didn't have very good memories of that Catholic school. I do remember being rapped on the fingers one time with a ruler, and that came back to me. And so I stood at attention almost, and I said, "Yes, sister, I am the author." And she said, "Well, I read your book." And I wasn't sure if that was good or bad because she didn't elaborate.
Right.
And I said, "Oh, thank you." And she said, "I wanted to tell you something." And I said, "Okay." And she said, I did not, and it was having a really hard time telling me this. And she said, "I have always kept what happened during that time to myself. And you made me realize that it was important to tell the story, because I did not escape the comfort house." Now, the comfort house, as you will learn in the book, is a place where they took girls, very young girls, to be used by the soldiers. And she was one of them that did not escape the comfort house. And many girls who did not escape the comfort house went to the convent afterwards. And she told me then, she said, "I have always felt such shame. I've always felt such guilt over something I must have done to do that." And then I realized that I need to tell my story. I need to tell my story because people need to hear it. And she said, "I have 2 gigs next week." 2 gigs. She was so pleased about being able to share her story that she did have this positive way about her, that she felt much better about her. Now, another story that I think it's sort of a predecessor to this, but my mother was a real rebel. She liked boy things. She liked climbing trees, playing sports, and she had very, very long hair, and she cut her hair off, which on the island of Guam was just an absolute no-no. You didn't cut your hair until you were married, but she cut her hair. And so her grandmother at the time was so angry, she shaved her head. Well, that was the same year that the Japanese landed, and she kept her head shaved. My grandmother kept my mother's head shaved.
Right.
But so when the Japanese came onto the island, they thought my mother was a boy. So they did not put her in the comfort house, even though she was 8. They were very young when they were placed in that horrible place. So that was the first time that haircut saved her life. You know, I just think that there are so many stories like that we end up hearing and thinking, what possible good could have come from that? That shaving of the head saved my mother's life, at least on that one occasion, and another one that you hear about in the book. But I love when people come up to me after the presentations and they tell me their stories about what happened to them. And we sit down and I learn so much about humanity and what we can overcome, not only individually, but when we join together. Because when you really think about it, we are together. We're all one. Whatever one person experiences and the fear, they can't keep it to themselves. We all end up sharing it.
Yes, indeed. And
so thank you for asking that question.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I know that you talked about your mother obviously shaving her head. Were there anybody else on the island that actually did that?
Well, I don't think very many did. My mother, as I said before, she was very much a rebel. She was had a very strong confidence level, and even though it was knocked down a lot during the time as a prisoner of war, that tenacity and rebellion really did help her. For example, one of the first things that they had to do every morning, they were awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they had to pray to the soldiers' God. Well, my mother didn't like to do that, but at the same time, she didn't want to die either. So she learned about being in a place and not actually being there, how she could separate herself from that and go to a place that was more positive for her. She learned that early on as a child. And I think as adults, we can do well to learn that. Now they call it mindfulness, but it is a way that we can go into ourselves when everything outside of us is so horrible or chaotic or whatever it might be. And we're certainly going through a lot of that right now, that we don't have to be caught up in it. We can actually go into ourselves, our center, and find where we are hopeful again. And I think because of the war, my mother learned to do that early on as a child.
And where was her center mentally?
Well, as a child, it was unfortunate because she really didn't have much of a childhood after that, as you can well imagine. And so her center, thank goodness for Grandmother Lily, and as I said, other people of strong faith, was that they knew that God was always with them. He was never gone. He was always there. He didn't ever abandon anyone. Right. It was us who turned our backs on him, not the other way around. And I think that because of Grandmother Lily and others, it was something that she was reminded of constantly, that she could always go to that. So she didn't have to have a church. She didn't have to have a pastor. She didn't have to have God's word. She could go into herself at any time and connect with him. Now, I have to tell you this story about was something that happened in my life as a result of being taught by her of that strong faith.
Right.
As I said, I was brought up as a Catholic. And do I have time to tell the story?
Sure, go for it.
Okay. I was 10 years old, and every week we went to confession. And I was a really good girl. I didn't get into trouble a lot. I just didn't. So I very rarely had something to confess. And so one week I decided I wasn't going to go to confession. so that the following week I would have something to confess that I didn't go to confession. So anyway, I went into the confessional. I was so proud of myself because I had a sin. That's the funniest thing. Anyway, I told the priest that, and he just reacted in a way that totally surprised me. By the time I left the confessional, I was in tears because he had just raked me over the coals. I mean, he was talking about how bad I was and I should never skip and all of that. Well, I left the confessional to go to do my penance, say my prayers in the church. And the more I thought about it, I really got angry about it because I was not a bad child, but I was made to feel like I was a bad child. So I did something that I just never would have expected from myself. I waited till everyone else left the church and he came out of the confessional. And I went up to him, my 10-year-old self, and you have to know, Quintin, I was just scared of my own shadow at the time. Especially, I had such a reverence for adults and people of the church. Mm. But I went up to him and I said, I'm not a bad person. And you made me cry. And from now on, I'm going straight to Jesus Christ. I'm not coming to you anymore. That's right. And I went out of the church. I threw up in the parking lot. I was so filled with emotion and dread that what I had done, and I was just going to be in so much trouble. But that spirit that was in my mother was very definitely transferred to me. Wow. And I indeed did not go back to confession. And I didn't tell my mother either that I had done that because she would not have been happy about that.
Yes, I would imagine too. And in the article from the Berkeley Independent, it says this. Obviously, it took you, to write the book 30 days. Once Dixon put down the first chapter, the rest flowed out as if it was waiting to be written. What else was waiting to be written?
What else is waiting to be written now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, it was very surprising to me that, because I didn't actually start out to write a book. I was listening to my mother's stories. It was obvious that she needed to tell somebody what had happened. Sure. So for about a year, I guess, I listened to her stories, basically. And one day she said, you need to write a book. And, being a good daughter, I said, okay. I really didn't expect that I could write a book. I never thought I couldn't write a book either. And as a matter of fact, the first iteration was nonfiction. And when I submitted it to a contest, the Words and Music contest in the city of New Orleans, they have this contest every year. It actually placed second, a semifinalist. Wow. So I knew that there was something to that. But the editor that I met at the time and the agent said that I needed to write this as a book of fiction and to just blow it out of the water. And I wrote it as a book of fiction because of the advice that they gave, okay. But also I didn't want anyone to challenge my mother's 8-year-old memory. This was her story. This was not a documentary, factual account. It was the account of how it had affected her. And so that's where that story came from. Now, other books I found out was I have been a writer. I wrote as a child and had totally forgotten everything about writing because life took over. I was a single parent for a long time, and then I was just so busy that I didn't write and I had given up. Well, now I'm writing the memoir and taking those stories that my mother gave affected her as an adult then, and then how it affected me as an adult, and how I passed on stories and lessons to my children and grandchildren.
And what are one of those stories that your children and grandchildren actually like right now, are actually interested in?
I think that the biggest thing that they're interested in, that it actually happened on an island and that it happened to their grandmother or great grandmother. Right. I don't think people realize, because most everyone has what we call an ordinary life. I mean, you go to work, you come home, you go to school, you come home, you go to church, you come home. It's not really anything that's catastrophic that ever happens to them. But when you have someone in your family that experienced the kind of experiences that she did as a prisoner of war, it stops and makes you think, who else could this be happening to? Because we have a society of people, we have no idea what they've experienced. I mean, one of the reasons that I feel like, and I say this to people too, is we need to say kind things as much as possible. It may be the only thing that happened to that person that you talked to that was good. Because when you say a kind thing and your heart opens up, the kind of effect that has on that person and other people around them is something that goes on and on. It's like the gift that keeps on giving.
Right.
So I think that's the biggest thing about my children and learning about their grandmother, because no one in our family knew that this happened. So this book educated not only my family, but my nieces and nephews.
Right.
For example, my uncle that was there, he was an interpreter. He knew English, Japanese, and Chamorro. So the Japanese used him as a translator. And when you're a translator, you don't know what Japanese sounds like. When the Chamorro people heard him speaking Japanese, the first thing that they did was they thought of fear. And so he was sort of ostracized, as was his family. But this gave his family an understanding of what their father or uncle was doing. And I think it had some healing to it. I think that's what happens with these stories, that they have healing.
And I know that obviously you had to went through obviously 33 rewrites with your editor. Which one of those stories that you wish you really could have kept in for your family?
Actually, I did go through. That was excruciating, by the way. Writing the book was easy. Editorialize, oh my gosh, that was just horrible. But the execution chapter, I didn't change that at all. The very first time I wrote it, it was as if my mother was inside my head helping me write that particular chapter, because I didn't have very many changes to that. There is one story called the chapter called "The Enemy Within," and I think probably of all the chapters, that's my favorite, because there's a choice that we all have. If we are reacting in fear, or if we're reacting with anger or hate, we alone have the way to change that. We don't know that a lot of times. And I think anyone who can help people understand that they're in control of that will not only help that person, but it will help society and the world as a whole. And I think that's what the Chamorro people did on the island of Guam.
Right.
They moved past that and were able to heal that island so much faster. There are parts of the world who have been able to hate and revenge. They feel like it's so important. But the lesson that the Chamorro people can show is you can gain so much more with forgiveness and love.
And what lesson did you write from writing your own book?
My own book, I think the biggest part of it is what I talked about a little bit earlier about
Right.
collateral damage.
Right.
There's so much about war that's transferred on to other people. It's not just the soldier who gets killed or maimed, who has to go back and totally learn to live their life in a different way. Or the PTSD is not just with the soldier. PTSD is shared by so many people with so much different trauma. What's going on in our lives today with COVID and with a lot of other things is going to be traumatic for so many people. And we need to understand how important it is to be able to deal with mental and emotional health issues, and to treat it with just as much importance as we do physical disabilities that happen after a traumatic event. Because we are about to see something that is not just going to affect us now, but generations to come. And we need to be prepared to be able to deal with that on a huge way, not hiding it as if it's not a problem. We need to embrace that we have to learn more about how we can heal the emotional self. all of us do, not just the medical professionals. We all need to understand how to help someone else get past their pain.
And how do
And I
you
hope that my second book is going to help us with that.
help? Oh, that's amazing. And how else would you prepare yourself, when these incidents come up and you write about it?
Yes, that's as I said before about choices. The name of the second book is actually I'm going back and forth between the title of Choices and Seeking Forgiveness, because I think there are so many of us that are seeing the rest of our lives based on one bad thing that we did. There was a book that I read, and for some reason, for example, it's um, oh, I know what it is. It's called Just Mercy. I don't remember the author, but it's an amazing book. If you ever get a chance to read it, it's about a man who is helping people who have been imprisoned because of issues that have happened, and they weren't actually guilty. But he talks about how one bad thing that you do doesn't mean that's who you should be defined as. Because what ends up happening is my mother had to do things when she was a prisoner of war that no child should ever have to be confronted with. And she has always been in a place where she's tried to seek forgiveness for something that she did as a child. And I'm hoping that my second book is going to help us understand we don't have to do that. We could just forgive ourselves. We have to start there. Forgive ourselves, understand others, and forgive others, and just move on instead of holding on and harboring that kind of hate or negativity, because all that does is manifest itself in more hate and negativity. And we need to get past that, because we can't, as a world, get to a place where we need to be filled with that. And it needs to start with who we are and what we need to forgive ourselves for, starting out there. I hope that answered the question.
Oh, absolutely. And now that you have these, obviously with the two books now, how do you define yourself as an author?
How do myself as an author? I am definitely a work in progress. I hope that I never get to a place where I'm done. I think that if we all have the ability to think that we're learning something and we don't get to a place where we're an expert, I mean, it's good to know something about something, sure, but not about ourselves. I think it's more important that we keep our minds open and accept that even if it's something that might look bad, it might be an opportunity to learn something about ourselves too. So just embrace it as a lesson that we could learn. COVID, for example, is very definitely horrible. One of the things that it has done in a positive way, even though I've lost a member of our family to it and had some close calls from people who have been sick from it, one thing I have noticed is how amazing some of the people are that we had forgotten about. You know, the people who do things that we totally took for granted. Our healthcare workers and our emergency responders and are the people who deliver things to us that we pay so little to. It's also all the good things that have come from people that have brought out the goodness in people, because we sometimes just have a need to give us an excuse to show how good we are. And unfortunately, catastrophic events are those kinds of things. So this traumatic event, I think, helps us bring it out. And as an author, I just want to keep on learning about people, because I think it's just amazing and fascinating.
Yes, indeed. Well, Sherry Dixon, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome to the award-winning Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you so much for having me, Quintin.
You're very welcome. Anytime.